Plato's doctrine of the two worlds seems to be reflected in the book of Hebrews. In chapter 9, verses 23 and 24, the writer says this: "Therefore it was necessary for the copies of the things in the heavens to be cleansed with these, that is, with the blood, but the heavenly things themselves with better sacrifices than these. For Christ did not enter a holy place made with hands, a mere copy of the true one, but into heaven itself, now to appear in the presence of God for us." And so the writer of Hebrews suggests that the earthly temple is a copy of the heavenly temple. And this is a reflection of Plato's idea that what we see on the earth is a shadow of the reality in the ideal universe above. Well, further from Plato is the idea of the immortality and pre-existence of the soul. Plato taught the pre-existence of souls and their transmigration or reincarnation after death. Furthermore, because of his belief that only the spiritual has permanence, he affirmed the eternal death of the body. Now, these tenets of his doctrine are opposed to Christian resurrection, but early Christians could point to Plato's assertion of the immortality of the soul for support of their hope of the resurrection. Okay, so the Christians would emphasize Plato's assertion of life after death while denying the idea of transmigration or reincarnation. Because of his teaching about the pre-existence of the soul, Plato taught knowledge as reminiscence. Okay, it was this doctrine of knowledge is based on the distrust of the senses as the means of attaining true knowledge. Senses can supply information only about objects of this world, but not about ideas, which to Plato are more important. Since true knowledge is only the knowledge of ideas, Plato taught the theory of reminiscence, whereby the individual remembered ideas held over by the pre-existent soul. Okay, obviously, mainstream Christianity did not accept pre-existence or reminiscence, but this distrust of sensory perception lingered, especially through Augustine's teaching of knowledge. For Augustine, all true knowledge proceeds from God, and the soul has the inherent power of self-knowledge. So we'll talk more about that when we get to Augustine and his maintaining Platonic ideas in his theology. But let's continue now with Plato and his idea of the good. All right, for Plato, the origin of the world is the work of a divine artisan or demiurge, a spiritual worker. He took formless matter and gave it form, imitating the beauty of the idea of the good. All right, the parallels with Genesis powerfully influenced early Christian thought. The differentiation between the idea of the good and the artisan of the universe established a dichotomy between the supreme being and the creator, which is entirely foreign to biblical thought, but which became rooted in the minds of some scholars who wished to assert the impassiveness of God, that is, the impossibility of God to suffer, simultaneously with his activity in the world. This source, plus Plato's monotheism, led to a discussion of God that utilized Platonic terminology for the idea of the good. That is, God is impassive, infinite, incomprehensible, and indescribable. All of these terms will be used by early Christians to describe God. Now, Aristotle was Plato's student, but Aristotle took philosophy in a different direction. He rejected Plato's doctrine of knowledge by reminiscence and said that learning comes through experience. All right, so he trusted the sensory experience of learning. So he pioneered the study of logic, the sciences of biology, physics, and psychology. Aristotle described the person as a whole being with an integrated body and soul. The soul does not exist apart from the body, although some aspect of the soul is not physical and survives death. All right, so there's some aspect of life after death according to Aristotle. But at the same time, he would say that the body is the prison of the soul. And so at death, the soul then escapes the body. He affirmed the presence of an impersonal, ultimate divinity termed the prime mover, which was the epitome of knowledge, actively causing all motion and passively attracting all objects by its magnetic supreme perfection. As we will see, Aristotle will influence Thomas Aquinas in the medieval era when Aquinas suggests his cosmological argument for the existence of God. So again, more about that later. But Aristotle sees in the infinite a prime mover, but this prime mover is not a personal God, but is an impersonal divinity. Now, most of Aristotle's works were lost to the West for 700 years until they were rediscovered and revolutionized Christian theology in the 13th century, thus sparking the scholastic era in the 1200s, which we'll talk about in the second half of this semester. But meanwhile, Plato's idealistic realism profoundly influenced the theology of early and medieval Christianity through Augustine and others. As we will see, Augustine was profoundly influenced by Neoplatonism, and so he preserved those ideas in the early church. Now, I want to speak to you about a philosophical concept known as dualism. It appears in numerous Greek philosophies, and according to this idea, spirit and matter are two co-eternal forces. Matter is evil, and only the spirit is good. For example, bodily resurrection is not acceptable in Greek philosophy, for the goal of life is for the spirit to leave the flesh behind after death. We just saw a bit of that in Aristotle. For this reason, this idea of dualism impacts other philosophies as well. For example, Stoicism and Epicureanism. You will remember in the story of Paul speaking to the philosophers at Areopagus or Mars Hill. The Stoics and Epicureans were interested in Paul's new philosophy until he spoke of the resurrection from the dead. And Luke reported to us that when they heard of the resurrection of the dead, some began to sneer, but others said, "We shall hear you again concerning this." And so they walked away. All right, this is because for these Greek philosophers, they could not accept the idea of bodily resurrection. Their dualistic philosophy led them to believe that death was freedom for the soul as is released from the body. They were not interested in the resurrection of the body. Dualism has influenced Christianity in a number of ways, because as the church expanded in this Greek context, matter was equated with flesh, which in turn was connected to sexual intercourse. And so sexual intercourse was connected with, if not evil, at least a lesser form of humanity. So dualism impacted Christianity through the impulse toward monasticism and clerical celibacy. And virginity, the abstinence from sexual intercourse, was elevated in the minds of the early church. This is going to lead to serious errors and problems later on, as we will see. But you will hear me refer to dualism over and over again as we talk about various heresies as well as practices of the early church. So let me summarize Greek philosophy. These philosophers were all preoccupied with a quest for the purpose of life, humanity in search of destiny. Most of them used philosophy as the way to answer the needs of a society with no moral foundation and no personal God. The bankruptcy of philosophy was evident in the fact that they asked questions for which they had no answers, but they prepared the way for the Lord Jesus Christ to answer these needs. So, let me summarize Greek religion and Greek philosophy. The Greeks described their gods in one of two ways. The first was through anthropomorphism, gods in the form of humans writ large. They had the same passions and weaknesses. They were just greater beings, but they could not inspire a moral, ethical life. And so many of the Greeks turned toward philosophy. And for them, divinity was a logical abstraction. All right, the divinity was distant, it was perfect, but it was abstract and not personal. Description depended upon logical syllogisms, many of these based on Platonic thought, such as God is perfect. A perfect being cannot suffer. Therefore, God must be impassible. That is, God must not be able to suffer. Then how does one describe God in this way when God takes on flesh and is crucified for our sin? All right. Another syllogism is that God is perfect. A perfect being cannot change, and therefore God must be immutable or unchangeable. And yet, the Word was God, it was with God, and yet the Word became flesh and dwelt among men. How is it that God can change and take on human form? All right, so these Greek logical syllogisms attempted to describe God, and in many ways, early Christianity was influenced by these ideas, but ultimately we had to find other ways to describe God according to what the Bible said about Jesus Christ, who took on flesh, became human, and suffered. All right. Well, we have wrapped up just a part of our study of the context of the early church, looking at the Greek world, looking at the Greek religion and Greek philosophy. Next, we'll turn our attention to the Roman Empire and the Hebrew background of the church. Thank you for your attention so far. All right, more to come.